right, Kate, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Coffee with Kate Noble, VP of Policy and Stakeholder Engagement. The event today is sponsored by New Mexico Gas. Our friends at New Mexico Gas have supported our work for many years through employee giving and also corporate support. We greatly appreciate our friends at New Mexico Gas, and I'll give a shout out to my friend and colleague, Anita Hernandez, who choreographs a lot of our partnerships. So thank you, Anita, for that. And thank you to New Mexico Gas. Some of you may not realize that over the past several years, we've had a policy branch at United Way of Santa Fe County called New Mexico Early Childhood Development Partnership, NMECDP. And we are now all under one umbrella, Growing Up New Mexico. Not only have we passed 4 accountability bills, we've collaborated to pass funding and implementation for a new Department of Early Childhood Education and Care in 2018. Those are big steps towards our shared goal of giving New Mexico's children and their families the opportunities they need to succeed. Shortly after Senate Bill 22 was passed, NMECDP at the time won the contract to do what was called a statewide needs assessment. And Kate, I imagine that was a huge job. Tell us a little bit about what your team did in the deep listening process of needs assessment for early childhood education and care in New Mexico.
It was a big task, and thank you, Abby. I'm really happy to be here, and it's always fun to talk about these things. And even now, it's been just about enough time to start to get some reflection on the needs assessment process. It's almost an eternity ago, but yes, it was the summer of 2018, and we were selected through, 2019, and we were selected through the RFP process. The contract began right around the fiscal year start in July, and it was initially a sort of, okay, we're going to do 10 or 11 community conversations in metro areas throughout the state. And this was at a time that Senate Bill 22, as you mentioned, had passed. So it was kind of in this organizing period and getting a run up. The Secretary Gruginski and her team were not yet in place. She started in December of that year. So the needs assessment began just before all of that. And we started mapping out different metro areas to do listening in. And long story short, because there were a lot of conversations, as there always are in these projects, it became clear pretty quickly that wasn't going to meet the appetite of New Mexico to talk about early childhood. So we changed tack very quickly, and the folks at the state were great in sort of making it work. And we said, we'll probably need more money if we're going to do more listening than what we initially proposed. And they found that. So we ramped up a team that very quickly went on the road, and we listened everywhere anyone would have us. And we established pretty quickly, we'd done some listening, some community conversations around something that had been funded by the Early Childhood Funders Group called a Business Plan for Early Childhood in the summer of 2018. And that was really when I started this work and realized that this is the most amazing work and that it is such a privilege to listen to people in New Mexico who have devoted their lives to early childhood and get them to tell their stories and say what they need and what they want to see happen in the system. And so we established a methodology, which is to go through trusted partners in communities. We didn't want to parachute in and say, come to this, that, or the other place. We really followed an ethos. And I think back to my days, I worked for BBC World News for a long time. And in this big, thick guide of producer guidelines where they told you how to work in the field as a producer, one of the key pieces of advice is seek and follow local advice. So we started doing that, and we would figure out what venue to use from guidance in local communities. And we would ask the folks we were in touch with, whomever we can, and we would go through early childhood channels and ask for who else we could talk to and just follow the natural networks of word of mouth and say, where should we go? Who should we invite? Who can we engage to help us get people to these events? And we did that throughout both the needs assessment and strategic plan. And in the end, we had the total number is something like close to 100 community conversations. And some of them were very small. And we would go to childcare centers at parent nights, and we would go through Head Start programs and their parent engagement, parents reaching out. We have dozens and dozens of partners who stepped up. And for me, coming from a world of economic and community development, early childhood is really wonderful because people really walk the values of early childhood. They are kind, they are inclusive, they are inviting, and they are honest. They share all of the things. So we were really met with a groundswell of welcome throughout the state. And then it became sort of self-sustaining. We had people reaching out to us from Raton and Clovis, and we didn't even realize that there were sort of budding early childhood coalitions in those places, but we got to meet them. We went to Gallup, we went to Farmington, we went to Shiprock, we went to Hobbs, we went to Jowl, we went to Gadsden, plus of course Las Cruces and Silver City and Deming. So we really went all over the state and in different ways, and on the advice of how different communities were comfortable, we listened and we asked 4 key questions, which are: what's working, what's not working, how do you want things to be, and what's getting in the way. And we did this across a spectrum of early childhood services. We had focus on infant and toddler, we had focus on maternal health, we had home visiting, we had childcare, we had the workforce as a focus area, and we had an amazing team of bilingual folks. We partnered significantly with the Native American Budget and Policy Institute to make sure that tribal communities were included, and that we would invite Native Americans who are living in urban areas, and that there would be a place to have a conversation focused on issues affecting Native Americans, and appropriately in sort of assessing the government to government relationship that tribal nations have with the state of New Mexico. We also partnered with an organization called Dual Language New Mexico for some of our facilitators to make sure that we had enough access to folks who particularly speak Spanish. Of course, we have a large Spanish speaking population. In Albuquerque, we partnered with an Asian center and also had Mandarin, and we had one other Asian language. It might have been Vietnamese translation going on at the event we had in Albuquerque. And also crucially, and this carried over as did the Native American Budget and Policy Institute partnership from the previous year's listening, but we partnered with an organization called the Center for the Education and Study of Diverse Populations, which is out of Highlands University and is very focused on exactly what it says. How do we study and educate diverse populations? And they look at the whole spectrum. But we, of course, were focused on early childhood, and a woman named Patricia Jimenez Latham actually led the facilitation team to make sure that we were being sensitive and welcoming to diverse populations in all of the different ways. So it really was this amazing effort of all these people coming together. And I must say, we had a lot of fun on the road because, we were learning incredible things and really just adjusting in each community we went to. And we had this truly responsive and flexible team. And then we'd get together for dinner most nights and talk about it and think through what we heard. And we started noticing things. We started noticing that some of the important information that people were sharing wasn't in answer to our questions. that it was happening at other times in the space in between the questions at the tables. So we started documenting that more explicitly. And really the whole process was a continual improvement process to how can we listen better? How can we be more responsive to communities? How can we gather all of the valuable information that people are sharing with us? One of the big things that we ended up talking about was simply the value of convening, because at any table when you're facilitating, you have the questions and you have your chart paper and you can write up what everybody says. But then when you stop, and this is about the spaces in between, folks would say, you know, I didn't realize you did that. And I do this, and we should talk about these things. And it would be great if we could partner in our community about this. And there was a real hunger for just bringing people together and giving them space to share information about what they were doing. And, you know, by the end of it, the facilitation team estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of individual connections and improvements had been made in communities simply because we had created the space for that to happen, and people sit across from each other. And again, they're early childhood people, so they share well, they partner well, they communicate, they work together, they understand all of the values that are embedded in early childhood and live them. And if there's any sort of headline that I would say from all of this incredible listening that went on during the needs assessment, it's that we have an amazing community, and anybody who works in early childhood knows this, but throughout the state of New Mexico. And so many people are sometimes unseen and unheard, but the richness and the heart and the soul and the passion that people have for their work. And that includes the folks at the state. It was then CYFD, and there were regional folks coming to these conversations. And it includes the home visitors, and it includes the family advocates who are showing up to parent nights. And it includes the leaders of centers and programs. And, you know, everywhere from Hidalgo County, which is the southwestern edge of New Mexico, the Boot Heel corner, to up in the northeastern corner, there are things going on that it was just an incredible honor to witness, and incredibly humbling to be given the gift of the information and the sharing that these folks did throughout the state, and to put it all together into the needs assessment and now into the strategic plan.
I remember your team at the office during the needs assessment. You were on road trips every week, and you had papers up on the walls with charting out your work, and such an amazing group of people. And I think one thing that really stood out for me in hearing about that process was how responsive you were to the communities you were going to, and how New Mexico is such a huge, huge state with so many different types of communities. And your intention really was to respect the infrastructure that was already there for childcare and learn about what the innovative and resourceful people of that community did. And it looks different in Albuquerque and Hobbs and Farmington and Santa Fe. So you must have just been really chewing on a lot of different input from all of those places and wanting to respect where that came from. And I appreciate you sharing about how much effort was put into that equity lens of really meeting people where they were at and hearing. Your job was really to listen. It wasn't to go and implement or tell them what was the best way to do early childhood education. And I think you all were recognized for the incredible work you did during the needs assessment. And then you won the contract to put together the strategic plan, which meant that you incorporated all of that input. So tell us about that.
Well, that was the hard part. And the strategic plan actually is going to be released next week. A save the date is going out this morning for noon on January 27th, I believe, is the Wednesday. Yeah. And the governor is going to headline the release of the strategic plan. We will also have 4 cabinet secretaries, including Secretary Lynn Trujillo of Indian Affairs, Dr. David Scrace of Human Services. We will also have, of course, Secretary Elizabeth Gruginski of Early Childhood, and I'm missing a third one. Dr. David Scrace is actually going to talk about data, which was an important part of the conversation. And it's really wonderful because with the human services, there's 2020 goals and a large federal initiative that's working, and it's all being integrated, and there is a lot of work to do. But really, as you say, we set up a war room in the office where we charted a lot of the themes and the listening. The needs assessment, I would say that was in a way the easy part, because we were able to listen and reflect what we heard. And we struggled during the needs assessment because, of course, when you're rolling up, and I just looked back at some of our numbers, we had more than 1,900 people in person engage in the needs assessment and strategic plan. We also did surveys. We had another sort of ethos of having both qualitative and quantitative data. So we did surveys for quantitative data under the guidance of Dr. Gabe Sanchez, who's the director of the social policy at UNM, and an incredible thinker around that. So total, we had almost 5,000. We had 4,730 folks engaged in the needs assessment and strategic plan throughout New Mexico, and almost 2,000 of them in person. But with the needs assessment, we got to just reflect what we heard. And for me, as a former reporter, that's very comfortable. The strategic plan was harder because then you have to answer the needs assessment, and you have to come up with strategies to deal with the key needs that have been identified. And that has been, and we went back and we started with our team, and we distilled, and we'd heard a lot of great strategies, which we had been mindful to capture while we were on the road, because of course the people out there in the state of New Mexico doing the work had really good ideas about how to get there. And when you ask the question, how do you want things to be? People will tell you, and they will often tell you how to get there. So we had done a pretty decent job of gathering a bunch of that, and we started distilling it. And then we started working with the folks in the system. Crucially, by this point, Secretary Gruginski had been named. It was actually in her first week or two on the job that we had our first meeting about the strategic plan. And bless her, she came in and, really just engaged in that immediately. And she must have had so much coming at her at that time. That was December of 2019 that we did that. And then we really spent all of 2020 developing the strategic plan in partnership with the leadership, particularly at the Early Childhood Education and Care Department under Secretary Elizabeth Gruginski, because it's the state's plan, and they were always clear on that. And it's a 0 to 5 system. It's crucially led by the Early Childhood Education and Care Department, but really it takes the whole Children's Cabinet. And Mariana Padilla, the director of the Children's Cabinet, who's out of the governor's office, was deeply involved from the beginning. And that's why for the launch, we're having all those cabinet secretaries come and talk about how the strategic plan really does stretch across different departments to embrace the whole prenatal to 5 system. But of course, 2020 was 2020. And so the department, which officially began full operations on July 1 of 2020, not only did they have to stand up a whole new department with a lot of moving parts to that, move contracts in for home visiting and childcare and family, infants, and toddlers, our early intervention program, but they had to do a strategic plan and this little thing like addressing a pandemic, and an incredible logistical mobilization to get personal protective equipment out to folks in the early childhood arena. So it was quite a year. And again, we just had to stay flexible. We had to listen to our counterparts at the state to what they needed, and to just be deeply responsive. And, 2020 was incredibly humbling for many of us. And um, in developing a strategic plan, I suppose it's easy to just say, this is how it needs to go and this is the process. And we just had to give up on all of that and do what we could and meet our partners at the state when and where we could and when they could think about it. And they did an incredible job of kind of doing all things at once, standing up a department, addressing a pandemic, and developing a strategic plan. Um,
Wow. Kate, I
yeah, and
wanted to
so we
just take,
finally got there.
yeah, a big year. And I wanted to take a step back just for anyone on the call who isn't an insider like you and knows all these details. Senate Bill 22 was in order to create a new department for early childhood education and care. And previous to that, state funds that impacted families with children under 5 were actually allocated in various departments. We had some at CYFD for home visiting, we had some pre-K dollars, and other places of the state government. And the point of Senate Bill 22 was to bring all those resources together so that we were really focusing a concerted, coordinated effort on families with kids 0 to 5. Another big advantage of having a department is we have more accurate data collection, which hadn't been solid before we had a department, that we couldn't really track. Are home visiting dollars leading to better education outcomes, or is the are the pre-K children doing better later in school? And so I think that putting together a system for data collection, and then I know that, what would you say are some of the advantages now of having the Department for Early Childhood Education and Care?
Well, yes, data is a big one. And I think, we're not there yet. There's still a lot of work to be done because it really is a complicated system. And governments, and this speaks, I can draw from my experience at the city of Santa Fe and the Santa Fe public schools. And schools are better at data than most folks, but it's not necessarily the strength of government to lead with great IT infrastructure and be on top of information management. There's so much that goes into running governments that this is something that all governments struggle with. And you're right, Abby. Functions were spread across 4 departments, including the Department of Health, which is where the Family, Infants, and Toddlers and Early Intervention was, Children, Youth, and Families, which is where there was pre-K, child care and home visiting, public education department, the public schools run pre-K, and there were some pieces, I believe, in the human services department as well. So there was 4 departments. And this goes back, it's been very intentional, and it predates me, but there was this business plan for early childhood that was done and funded through the Early Childhood Funders Group. And there were, and when I joined in 2018, it was in part to go out and vet that in the community. And there were these 5 levers, but we really are following that planning and that intentionality. And the first lever was governance. And as we listened in 2018, so this even predates the needs assessment, it was a much sort of scaled down listening process, or rather the needs assessment scaled up the listening process. But what everyone said, almost without exception, as we heard in 2018 during that first process, was we need more alignment. The system is disconnected. So it really validated what had been a long push by people who are incredibly smart and intentional about this, to say, we may need a department to focus on this because it's so spread across. And so to answer your question, one of the big improvements is accountability. It's really clear who runs early childhood now and who is responsible for it. And it wasn't. I think we're getting there with data. And they're doing a huge amount of work to bring the data together, to be responsive to it. I mean, the accountability, the leadership, the unification piece, I don't know that can be overstated.
And I
Because
also feel like it put early 0 to 5 on the education spectrum. Like now
Yes.
we have early ed, public ed, higher ed, and so it's not just daycare at 0 to 5. It's really the seeds of education that then get carried on in the other education
And
spectrum.
your sound's cutting out a tiny bit, but that's exactly right. And that was one of Senator Padilla, who was one the lead sponsor really on Senate Bill 22. But he would talk about exactly that. We've got early childhood, public education, and higher ed, and so we now have a continuum really for cradle to career, if you will, and it has organized it. That alignment cannot be understated or overstated, how important that is. And it has created a focus for everything to be thought of more as a continuum rather than, what Catherine Freeman has described as a spectrum of services. And really now the department is looking at the continuum. Policymakers are trying to think about it that way. And then there's the public education and then there's the higher ed. So we do have a really more coherent system.
Right. Well, and another thing, just to add to 2020 and all that it challenged you, was the spotlight on equity and racial justice, and so that was another seed to work into your plan. And so I'm curious. Tell us about embedding equity in early childhood systems and considering economic equity for the early childhood workforce.
Yes. Well, I would say, in large part, due to our incredible partners, but we started with this. It didn't come in 2020, fortunately. And a lot of people, of course, have been thinking about this for a long time. And our incredible partners at the Native American Budget and Policy Institute, in New Mexico, when you start thinking about tribal sovereignty and what some of the historical trauma is that's gone on with Native American communities, you have to have an equity lens. And we really did start with that in trying to put thinking about tribal communities at the forefront of this, in trying to and really challenging ourselves and everybody involved to do it better than it had been done before, to think about independent nations, to think about government to government relationships, to think about historical trauma and embed all of the things that we need to do to be better, because and to recognize the deep systemic inequities and that everything does have a dominant culture lens and that we need to deconstruct that and that it's going to be deep work and take a long time. But we really worked to put, and I mentioned the Center for the Education and Study of Diverse Populations and Dual Language New Mexico. So these organizational partners that we had that were really looking at this for a long time and had done deep work, and we were fortunate to benefit from their involvement and perspective and make sure, so there's the Native American piece, and we worked on that with the Native American Budget and Policy Institute, and really trying to always have that perspective of historical trauma, of government to government relationships, of thinking about how do we do this better with Native American communities. And then with our other partners, it was a lot about equitable access. And we hear about that, and it's really, sometimes equity feels complicated, but when you talk to folks on the ground, it's not complicated. It's language. Do you have the ability for people who speak a language other than English to engage? So, we got to some really fundamental equity principles, like everything's got to be translated into Spanish because that is our predominant second language in New Mexico. And then we found the Asian Family Center in Albuquerque, and, we're able to do more languages and that sort of thing. We asked tribes if we needed indigenous translation or anything like that. And actually the answer was very often no. And language is really the same as culture for many tribes. And sometimes it's not open to outsiders and people aren't welcome. So there was a lot around that, but we had, of course, the tribal sovereignty lead the way into how we approached indigenous language. But we made sure everything was accessible in Spanish. We did all our materials in Spanish. we offered transportation. That's another one, just sometimes getting to an event or being able to participate. Now, of course, there's a broadband equity issue, who can get online and that sort of thing. But we tried to walk the walk from the beginning, and we did okay. Of course, we could have done better, and more money always helps. But we did offer rides, and we had team members arranging transportation for people to events. We offered food, because food insecurity is a very big issue. And if that was something that, made a difference for folks, we wanted to be sure to do that. We kind of had an open invitation. Well, we had childcare. That's another one, of course, in early childhood for families raising young children. Sometimes getting childcare is rough. So we really worked to, through the process, bring down the barriers, and we learned a lot, and there's still more to do. And again, we went through trusted advisors. So in Santa Fe, we were welcomed by the Santa Fe Recovery Center. So we got to talk to some families struggling with substance misuse. And we went through these groups that are working with the immigrant community. There's so much distrust in our undocumented populations. We went through groups that worked with undocumented folks in order to have that trust. And so it wasn't just scary and strange. But really, we continue to work with and struggle to bring the equity lens. And one thing I would say, it still makes me cry, but when Senate Bill 22 passed on the House floor, which was the last process. It passed through Senate committees, then the Senate floor, then it crosses over chambers, and it passed through House committees, and then it passed on the House floor, and then it goes to the governor for signature. But Representative Georgine Lewis, who is Native American, took the mic for a moment on the floor of the House and said, this bill is really one of the first times we've seen thinking about Native American communities be put at the forefront of governance structure. And that was in part because we had done that listening, and that was part of the communication through the bill process. And it led to the creation of this position, which is an Assistant Secretary for Native American Early Education and Care, which is now staffed by a wonderful woman named Giovanna Archuleta. And that was really at the advice of what we heard and some good thinkers about how to work with Native American communities. And they said, you know what, you need somebody dedicated to this and working with tribes. And it's really great to see that structure is making a difference and is continuing, and the great work that Assistant Secretary Archuleta is doing to continue listening with tribes and working to really finally activate the uniqueness of government to government relationships and respect in what that department does has been really incredible to see that sort of bear fruit.
That's amazing, Kate. And it is really very encouraging to see the efforts being made. And like you said, it's long-term work, and it's not something we'll ever get to the end of, but that equity lens is an important part of what we're doing now in New Mexico. And as my last question to you, you mentioned it last night at the opening event, but I'd like you just to comment what you have found through the needs assessment and strategic planning about workforce in early childhood education, and what your comments are about that.
I knew there was a piece of your last question that I didn't get to, and that is the economic equity piece. And this is really, it become incredibly important. It's the piece that fires me up these days, every day, because if you think about it, early childhood and the early childhood workforce, which is hugely women of color, and it's staffed throughout by women of color. And that, I realize in all of the great listening that personally I was able to do through these processes, that's part of what's been amazing. Is it's the leadership, wisdom, intelligence, experience, passion of women of color throughout the state that we heard. And to hold that and to really have those voices so loudly, it has been the educational experience of my lifetime, and it is incredible. And to layer on that, some sort of macroeconomic thinking. I come from an economic development and community development background, and actually I was always thinking about workforce development. And from an industry side, you think about labor supply. You think about, the classic economic indicators, unemployment. And that's the way it works at the big picture level. And in early childhood, it is absolutely fascinating because, and always talk about a skilled workforce, which we're still talking about in early childhood, but to sort of bring together this deeply visceral thing and listening and let's say heart element, emotional piece of having heard just personally, and this is my own journey, what I heard during that listening, and then the thinking and the macro stuff. And you start to realize with the equity lens and all of this, this is the intersectional industry of all of them. This is frankly sexism and racism embedded in low wages in this industry. And that's the economic equity issue, and looking at how we get to even remotely a sort of fair pay for the value of the work is a really big challenge, because early childhood childcare has enabled every other industry forever. And that perhaps goes as back to the sort of, I would say, sexist construction of a woman stays home and the single family income is earned by a man, and a woman's work, a woman raises the children, and that sort of thing. And, then historically, as we had some work on gender equality, white women entered the workforce and then still needed somebody to care for their kids. So that was very often women of color. I mean, it goes back to slavery, certainly in this country, that was how that worked. And these systemic inequities still carry through. And it is reflected in the wages and the value of this work that is still, we have had great participation from the business community that understands that absenteeism and distracted employees are in large part when parents and families are having issues with their kids. And so this workforce is taking that on and is caring for them. I mean, I say, we're not done until early childhood folks are paid as well as lawyers. It's a high bar. I don't know if we can get there in my lifetime, but gosh, a lot of us are going to try, because the value of what this brings to society, which we don't measure well, it's not reflected in our industrial output, in GDP, in any of these traditional measures. And this was sort of what I was trying to get to in some of my remarks last night, is 2020, I really do think there is, in all of the messed up stuff that happened, there is just a giant opportunity, because people on a very large scale started to understand that viscerally, because they were home with their kids, or employers are dealing with their employees' distraction and all of the things that come from parents being home with kids. And I could say from personal experience, it is incredibly hard, and it is incredibly unpredictable, because when I have a really important work thing, almost without fail, that is when something is going to happen with my child, like he started puking last night, but that's a whole other story. And the fact is, on some visceral level in 2020, I do think we got to a different place as a society in understanding the value and importance of early childhood. And the science has long been there. We know about the brain development and how important those early years are. And what I hope we get to a greater understanding, and home visiting is so big in this, is how we can strengthen families and we can give parents the skills they need early on. Because when you first become a parent, you don't know what you're doing. As much as we'd all love just to, the minute you become a parent, a chip gets embedded and you know everything, that's not actually how it works. We're not in the matrix. And so you have to learn. And if we support families and do that coaching early, not only will we improve child outcomes because the kids benefit, we know that and the science is behind it, but we strengthen families forever. So that when they're parenting teenagers, they will have better coping skills. They will have better boundaries and regulation and all of the things that you learn with a toddler. And I really see that this is perhaps one of the great causes of our time, is to work on economic equity for the early childhood workforce. And it's nothing short of how we save the world, because
So true. So
the
true. I love that.
foundation matters to everything and enables everything else to be successful. And until we really understand that and build a strong foundation, we're going to be on shaky ground, and we have an opportunity to take that now. So it's sort of like the political calls, it's time to get to work now and that sort of thing. But I really do see that in early childhood, we've come a long way, and we stand on the shoulders of a huge amount of work and blood, sweat, and tears throughout the years, but we can't let up now because the call and the importance is clearer than ever. And we have an opportunity to really do this work around economic equity and to bring this workforce into the value and spotlight that they have always deserved.
Thank you, Kate. That's absolutely true. And I think if 2020 has really shined a light on the importance of childcare and the essential services of childcare in order for other industries to operate, healthcare industry and the essential workers, and that childcare is one of the pieces of that puzzle that, like you said, really allows other industries to flourish. And so I think that it's time that we see the value, like you were saying. And so Kate, I'm going to go ahead and end it here and give everyone a minute to stretch their legs before our 10 o'clock event, which is with Jen Salinas, the director of the Early Learning Center at Connie. Amazing information about their philosophy, their curriculum, their COVID response as an early learning center and childcare center, and then also a really beautiful video from their staff, other teachers in the school, as well as families that are sharing their experience participating in the program at Connie. So in closing, our policy work is generously funded by several private partners. If you have been inspired to support our policy work, please consider a donation to this critical work. We are creating an infrastructure that will support New Mexicans for generations to come. Please contact me, Abby Bordner, at Growing Up New Mexico to discuss options to make a generous donation. And the Anderson Foundation has granted a match for all donations this weekend up to $15,000. I checked our event page right before this event and we were at $11,000. So go to the event page in order to find all the links to every event coming up, as well as to donate and to get raffle tickets. Everything is in that one location. We also have our new website up, growingupnm.org. Check that out with the combination policy and program work all under one name. Kate, thank you so much for the work you've done and the work you will continue to do for early childhood education in New Mexico.
Thank you.